it's not a secret, and I haven't really tried to keep it a secret, that my mental health has kind of been on the rocks for a while now. Not too long ago, I found a book on Amazon and purchased it rather compulsively. It's called When Darkness Seems My Closest Friend by Mark Maynell. It's based off of the Psalm. I can't remember the exact number of the Psalm. I think it's Psalm like 88 or something like that. But it says neighbor and friend. Oh, actually, it's right here. It's Psalm 88, verse 13. It says, "You have taken from me friend and neighbor. Darkness is my closest friend." But this is a book where Mark Maynell details his experience with mental illness, in his case, namely depression and PTSD. But I've been reading through this book. I've really enjoyed it so far. But I did come across a passage that I wanted to share with you guys here recently. He says Job's situation was not identical to David's, of course. David's friends desert him because they appear unable to cope with his pain. Job's 4 friends, on the other hand, his so-called comforters, do stick with him. 3 of them get it right to begin with. In Job 2:12 through 13, it says, "When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was. Then they make their first error. They open their mouths. They initially intend to console Job, but they end up accusing him. Each tries to prod Job into a confession. They assume that the extremity of his suffering could only be explained by some appalling but concealed transgression. To illustrate, here is one of the 4, Zophar. In Job 11, verses 4 through 6, "You say to God, 'My beliefs are flawless, and I am pure in your sight.' Oh, how I wish that God would speak, that he would open his lips against you and disclose to you the secrets of wisdom. For true wisdom has 2 sides. Know this, God has even forgotten some of your sin." Zophar follows the logic of what we now recognize as the Hindu notion of karma, a cosmic law whereby the universe determines that each of us gets what we deserve. If I sin, I suffer. As Psalms 32 and 38 illustrate, genuine guilt does lead to suffering, whether physically, mentally, or spiritually. The great irony is that by the close of the book of Job, God does indeed speak, but he does so in order to vindicate Job and rebuke his friends. Zophar has been far too simplistic. Like his fellow comforters, he assumes that the world is neat, tidy, and above all, logical. He presumes that if Job is suffering, it is because there are secret sins that Job has concealed. It matters little that he cannot identify them himself. He's merely concealing them from himself in that case. For in this kind of world, suffering must always be a punishment. It is logical. How else to explain pain in a world ruled by a God who is sovereign and just? Now, it is true, there are instances of this in the Bible. It may simply be the natural consequences of my actions, or equally, the result of God handing us over to those consequences, as the Apostle Paul puts it in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32. In fact, because of his apostolic insight, Paul discerns that it is the Corinthians' sinful behavior at the Lord's Supper which results in their declining health, or worse, in 1 Corinthians 11, 29 and 30. So if Paul can do that, can we? Can we assume that the equation between sin and suffering is reversible? If individuals are suffering, must the cause always be their sin? That is certainly how a karmic worldview works. If I have a car accident, or my children get sick, or I battle with depression, it must be because of some terrible deed, whether in this life or, in the Hindu worldview, in a previous life. It is simple retribution. But while there is logic to it, there is also a brutality and an oppressiveness. It hardly fosters genuine charity or compassion, since somebody else's suffering is deserved. They deserve to be left alone to stew in their pain, self-pity, and misery. But life is not so straightforward or cruel, and the Judeo-Christian worldview of the Bible profoundly rejects karmic causality. Thankfully, Job, who knew that his sin was nothing as serious as to deserve such pain, he instinctively understood that suffering has several possible causes. We can suffer because of the selfishness and sin of others, whether it is directed against us or not. In fact, the majority of stories and daily news bulletins could be grouped under this category, from the multinational right down to the neighborhood. Then there are the afflictions for which others are less blameworthy, natural disasters or diseases, apart from those that result from lifestyles or behaviors. When we put these down to simple bad luck, to being in the wrong place at the wrong time, there seems to be no rhyme or reason behind it. This genuinely is innocent suffering, not because anyone is entirely innocent, none of us can claim that, but because our suffering is not deserved. This was the great conviction behind the book of Job, for Job resolutely clings to the point despite the comforters, and God proves him right in the end, despite frustratingly never giving him an alternative explanation for his pain. After the Lord had said these things to Job, he said to Eliphaz the Temanite, I am angry with you and your two friends, because you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has. So now take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. You have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has. Job chapter 42, verses 7 through 8. I want to do what God commended Job for doing, and I want to speak the truth about God to you today. So what Mark details in this is that, yes, sometimes our suffering is a direct result of our sin. In instances such as the alcoholic whose liver fails, his liver fails because of his alcohol consumption. The man who cheats on his wife and then his wife leaves him. Her leaving could be the direct result of his cheating on her. Excuse me. But that's not always the case. Many times when we suffer, we always like to ask the question, why? Why is this happening to me? What did I do to deserve this? And so we come up with all these scenarios in our head. Well, maybe this is happening because, I shouldn't have watched that movie last night. Maybe I stubbed my toe getting out of bed in the morning and a certain 4-letter word left my mouth. Maybe this is because I gave that truck that cut me off in traffic today a certain unpolite gesture through my window. Maybe this is happening because I forgot to pay my tithes with my last paycheck. Now we come up with all these different scenarios of why something could be happening to us, and the truth of the matter is that you're just daydreaming. That a lot of what you're going through has no direct connection to a sin that you have committed. You're not going to flip somebody off in traffic and then be stricken with cancer because of that. That's not the way God works. You're not going to stub your toe in the morning and say a dirty word and then lose your job. Or maybe, you've done something a little bit more grievous than that. But that's not why you've lost someone that you cared about, a friend or a family member. Our suffering, more often, I think, more often than not, is the result of somebody else's sin or just living in a fallen world. We think of the wildfires that we had last year. This is part of living in a fallen world. The riots and the protests we had over race issues are due to the injustice that many people face on a daily basis. But that is not necessarily those people's fault. It's just the fault of, it's not necessarily their sin, it's other people's sin. A lot of the suffering, I venture to say most of the suffering that we experience on a daily basis is just a product of living in a fallen world. COVID. The Bible talks about how there will be plagues, pestilences. That's not any one person's fault. It's just living in a broken world where we have viruses, where viruses change and they mutate, and people get sick, and unfortunately people die. But that's not because of their sin or even anyone else's sin. That's just part of living in a fallen world. But we always want to know why. And I don't think that why is a productive question to ask. Because truthfully, we're likely to never know why something happens to us. When we get sick, someone we love gets sick, when someone we care about passes on, when people betray us, we're likely to never know why God allowed us to go through these things. We can trust that since God is good, that whatever suffering we endure is necessary. That God is not going to put us through something unnecessarily. That whatever He does for us is for our good and is for our benefit, even if it's not pretty. But whatever God allows to happen, why ever God allows it to happen, we might not ever know the reason why. So why, to me, feels like a very unproductive question. I think it would be better to ask different questions. In James chapter 1, James is talking about enduring through trials and temptations. And in verses 3 and 4, James says, "You know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Sam Alberry, in his commentary on James, says about these verses, in one sense, his point is straightforward. Trials teach us to persevere. They put us in situations where it is not easy to keep going, and where we will only do so with a measure of determination. And perseverance is the means to a wonderful end, that we be mature and complete, not lacking anything. James is talking about being rounded and formed as a Christian, growing into the very people we were created and saved to be. So I think instead of asking why, it would be more beneficial and more productive for us to ask, how? How can I grow through this? How can I grow closer to God and come closer to God? How can I better serve God through this? How can I use this to strengthen my faith? And asking these questions, I believe, will be much more fruitful than spending our time wondering why this happened to us, why we had to go through this, why our friend, why our family member, why our loved one had to go through this. Instead of asking why, I think it's better to ask how. How can I come closer to God, to love Him and serve Him more than I did before? So I don't pretend to know everything that all of you guys are going through. I probably don't want to know everything that you guys are going through. But I want you to know that it's not necessarily your fault. Maybe, you can say, well, this is the direct result of my sin. I did something and this is the direct consequence of it. Then repent and ask God to forgive you and go in peace. But if not, and most likely, it's not anything that you did. I want you to rest easy, to know that whatever you're going through, God has a purpose for it. And that instead of being your fault, it's really just living in a fallen world. And so I want to encourage you guys to seek God, to pursue God, spend time in His Word, spend time with Him in prayer. Surround yourself with other people, with godly people that will encourage and motivate you to pursue Christ and grow closer to Him. And I love you guys, and I'm praying for you, and you know that I'm always here for you. Thank you.